when trying to uncover sort of the insidious food allergy that may be causing your fatigue, your insomnia, your brain fog, your joint pain, your skin issues, the testing doesn't seem to be accurate. And as the study before this showcased, listening to your body is probably the best way to go. Hey everyone, this is Dr. Ruscio. Let's jump in with more research updates on gut health. Specifically, we put together a consortium of studies on dysbiosis, your immune system, and how diet can be used to improve dysbiosis. Now, if you haven't heard the term dysbiosis, it's the opposite of what you want to be, which is eubiotic or eubiosis, meaning balance. Just like you may have heard the term euthyroid, meaning your thyroid output is normal. Well, eubiosis means that the commensals, the bacteria, the flora in the intestinal tract are balanced if it's eubiotic and imbalanced if it's dysbiotic. Now, one or two sort of prefacing remarks. The term dysbiosis can be helpful as sort of a heuristic, meaning that when there are symptoms, we can infer there's probably a degree of dysbiosis present, yes. Do we need to be uber specific with how we quantify, identify, and test? Probably not. And I make this caution because, as you probably become accustomed to me sharing, there's a very slippery slope with lab testing wherein we can very easily go over this event horizon where we spend or waste money and we chase numbers rather than improve the health and the symptoms of the individual. So let's unpack this more thoroughly, this condition of dysbiosis and what it correlates to, also what you can do to improve dysbiosis if you suspect you have it. This first study looked at IBS and its association to dysbiosis. So IBS, meaning you have bloating, gas, pressure, pain, constipation, diarrhea, or perhaps an oscillation between the two. And in this observational study of about 1,000 individuals, healthy versus IBS cohorts, they did find that upon stool testing analysis, those with IBS did have more dysbiosis. But hang on, before you go out and say, I must do a stool test, a few important points. We've discussed this lab testing known as the GA map, which is included in the doctor's data profile here in the States. And they have validated that their measure of dysbiosis correlates and can discriminate healthy controls from IBS versus IBD cohorts. So this is good. However, they still have not documented that that test result allows you to better treat or better tailor a care plan for an individual. So what this means is if you're not feeling well, you do a stool test, you have dysbiosis, and your doctor says, well, we've got to treat the test XYZ way because of your dysbiosis. There is zero data to inform that approach. So I want to be really careful to kind of save you from going down a road that took me many years to realize was the wrong road, which is looking at Lactobacillus acidophilus being low or Bifidobacterium infantis being low on a stool profile, perhaps a dysbiosis profile, and saying, we need to give more of that probiotic, withhold that probiotic, or give someone prebiotics because of these findings. And as we'll tie in a little bit later, if you treat the dysbiosis numbers with higher prebiotics, you will very likely flare an individual. And we covered in the podcast before, a meta-analysis that found zero positive impact on IBS with prebiotics. I do think there are time and place exceptions where prebiotic can be helpful, but all this just to say that you don't want to treat the dysbiosis lab results. There's a correlation, but the labs don't allow us to better personalize treatment. So this study should not be taken out of context. Correlation, yes, between IBS and dysbiosis. Does this tell us how to better resolve IBS? No. Again, I make a point just to save you the time and money that is so often wasted. Now, this next study, quite interesting. It's actually, so this is summarizing 3 separate studies that help us better understand lesser known or appreciated causes of dysbiosis. This first study, look at this, they found in rank order, decongestant medications were the most impactful on causing dysbiosis. Second to that, shockingly, proton pump inhibitors or acid-lowering medication, acid-suppressing medication. And then third to that, least impactful, so surprising to me, were antibiotics. Now, we are going to be doing a follow-up specifically unpacking this study, and we're currently analyzing to see if there are certain decongestants that are more benign and certain decongestants that are more disruptive or dysbiosis-genic, I guess you could say. But consider the fact that most decongestants are what's known as sympathomimetic, meaning they stimulate the sympathetic nervous system. This can be beneficial. It can help with fatigue, and it can help through vasoconstriction to open up the nasal passage and allow you to breathe. But we also know that stress, when levels are too high, when there's too much activation of the sympathetic nervous system, this can lead to dysbiosis. So what might be happening here is, albeit the decongestants are helping with the congestion, because they're sympathetic mimicking and they stimulate these adrenergic receptors, I believe they're known as, that may lead to some of the negative effects that too much sympathetic stimulation can cause on this colony of bacteria in your body and lead to dysbiosis. And again, the fact that decongestants were the most tightly correlated with dysbiosis is fairly surprising. I should also be careful to say this does not mean that I'm endorsing to never use a decongestant. When I'm sick, I will use them on occasion. And it's just important to have sort of a healthy contextualization of these findings, meaning, especially if you have seasonal allergies, right? For the occasional cold and flu, probably not going to be enough volume of use to have an appreciable impact, or at least I wouldn't think. But if you have seasonal allergies and you're using decongestants in an ongoing fashion, maybe look for other options first. Now, certain dietary changes have been shown to improve congestion. And if you know someone who's gone, let's say, on an elimination diet, you may have heard, I cut out dairy and I was less congested, or I cut out X and I was less congested. So that's one thing to consider. Probiotics have also been shown to reduce various congestive conditions like rhinosinusitis, like conjunctive allergy. So important to also keep that in mind, that there are tools. There are natural antihistamines that can also be helpful, like bromelain and quercetin. And then if you do need a decongestant, I would say use one, but just understand that there may be a gut-associated side effect that we haven't fully appreciated up until now. Another area of interest was a different study looking at air pollution and finding that those who were in areas with higher air pollution had more pathogenic bacteria, less beneficial bacteria, and also a higher degree of mucosal inflammation. And one thing to keep in mind here is that most barrier systems or mucosal membranes in the body tend to correlate together. So this is why some people may notice that if they have a flaring of their gut, they may have a flaring of their mood, because the gut barrier and the blood-brain barrier and the lung barrier and the bladder barrier tend to function together. It's not an absolute rule, but there tends to be this general trend that these mucosal membranes, your skin, your lungs, your intestinal tract, your bladder, your genitourinary tract, function in tandem. So not surprising to see that pollutants that you inhale may lead to higher mucosal inflammation that also correlates with more pathogenic and less healthy bacteria. And we have a couple options for you for filters in a moment, but I just want to close out these 3 studies with poor sleep, and that less than 7 hours of sleep was shown to correlate with less beneficial bacteria and, in my mind, most importantly, more gastrointestinal symptoms. So if you're not prioritizing sleep, bear that in mind. A few basics that you may know but are worth sort of echoing: don't drink caffeine much beyond noon. Some people can get away with it, but I myself cannot. And also be careful about if there's caffeine in. So one thing I care about is my hair, and there are shampoos that are helpful for reducing hair loss that contain caffeine. There was a 1 week period I thought I was losing my mind because I just could not sleep. I thought something broke inside my body. I looked at the label of this shampoo, and caffeine was one of the ingredients. Stopped using the shampoo and I could sleep just fine, or I only use the shampoo in the morning. So caffeine timing is one. Getting light exposure during the day can help anchor your circadian or your day-night rhythm. And then also what you do before you go to bed. Reducing stimulation, not eating too much, not having too much blue light are all things that can help with sleep. As well as if you're having gastrointestinal symptoms, ironically, GI symptoms can thwart sleep. And if you're someone who has, let's say, diarrhea or abdominal pain, you may notice that you sometimes wake up with those. So you can directly focus on sleep hygiene, as it's known as, and also improving your gut health to optimize sleep. And there seems to be this bidirectional relationship between sleep and your gut health. And a few things that can improve air quality would be looking at the cleaners and also the fragrances that you're using. Many of these contain unsavory synthetic ingredients, and Environmental Working Group has a nice website where you can check. Air fresheners, I think a ubiquitous form of pollution, are all these synthetic and plasticized fragrances that in large doses you want to be wary of. Again, being careful to stave off heresy. This doesn't mean that you have to weed out every potential synthetic fragrance anywhere, but just be mindful to try to weed these out as reasonably as you can. And then finally, air filters can help to filter particulates out of the air and improve air quality. Okay, continuing within this theme of dysbiosis, this next study looked at patients with inflammatory bowel disease who were in remission, meaning they had no symptoms, they were feeling just fine, and correlated these individuals to dysbiosis. What they found was that those with inflammatory bowel disease in remission did have lower diversity, reduced Akkermansia, and more pathogenic bacteria. But the key thing that I want to point out for you that may not be so obvious is that these were perfectly healthy individuals. They had inflammatory bowel disease at one point that was active. They were now quiescent, no symptoms, and feeling okay, but there was still some dysbiosis. Now, how we interpret this kind of depends. The way I would interpret this is, yay, celebrate the win, because while we know there's a correlation between dysbiosis and health conditions, we want to be careful not to just treat lab tests. And so if someone has some dysbiosis but feels well, I don't think any more needs to be done other than simple low-hanging fruit to improve their health. What do I mean by that? Well, if someone who had Crohn's or ulcerative colitis and is now in remission was eating an unhealthy diet, I mean, frankly unhealthy. Lots of, let's say, processed food or, I think processed food would really be the main one. Or maybe lots of sugar, kind of lumped in with processed food, I suppose. Go after that low-hanging fruit. If they could maybe have more nutrient density in their diet, sure, go after that. If they're eating yogurt and they're seemingly okay with yogurt, do they have to be dairy-free, gluten-free, low lectin, low histamine, low FODMAP? No. So it's important to know where to draw that line, right? Would they need to undergo probiotics and herbal antimicrobials, elemental dieting, and all this razzmatazz? No, I don't think so. And again, this is important to delineate because all too often people have the labs treated at the exclusion of the individual. And remember, we don't have any data that tell us how to treat dysbiosis. So if you see dysbiosis in a healthy person, you probably don't need to worry about it. And I would also venture a guess that when these individuals were active in their disease, they probably had much worse dysbiosis. So we want to compare someone to their worst and appreciate likely that when someone was in a flare, their dysbiosis was worse. Now they're much better. May they ever fit the perfect eubiotic definition? Maybe not. But does that mean we have to keep treating them? I don't think so. Debatable, but I like to be a pragmatist. If someone's not feeling well, use therapies to help them. If there's just a lab finding that's skewed, unless there's simple low-hanging fruit interventions like diet and lifestyle, I wouldn't subject someone to jumping through all these therapeutic hoops. And this is a good additional study that reinforces my thinking. This is a meta-analysis of 34 studies in about 1,700 participants with eosinophilic esophagitis. So this is an atopic inflammatory condition of the throat. If you've ever felt like something was stuck in your throat, you had this throat clearing, this sort of scratchy feeling like, oh, there's a piece of rice or a piece of food stuck in there, you might have eosinophilic esophagitis. Now, this also tends to correlate, EOE as it's known, eosinophilic esophagitis, with things like IBS and other symptoms down the line of the intestinal tract. But here's the key thing I want to point out for you. They compared empiric elimination diets to testing-based elimination diets. What they found was that empiric elimination diets were vastly more effective. Now, what does empiric mean? Empiric means you run an experiment and you can use your symptoms to guide how you proceed, which is exactly what we use in our consulting practice. We call it evidence-guided empiricism, meaning we use you and your symptoms and the response of the individual to generally steer the recommendations. So a 93% response rate with empiricism, looking at the person's symptoms to guide the diet. A 69% response rate with the testing guided elimination. The other thing I want to point out for you is in this table here, look at the foods that came up as the most problematic. Dairy, wheat, eggs, nuts, legumes, and seafood. These are commonplace foods to eliminate and reintroduce on an empiric elimination reintroduction diet. So you can save yourself the $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 perhaps of testing. So the $500, $600, $700 or $1,000 worth of testing. And you may remember back to a case study that we shared on our channel maybe 3 months ago, wherein an individual who was a little bit anxious at baseline and had IBS did about $2,400 worth of testing, 2 of which were food allergy tests. Following those tests led to no improvement in how she felt, but did lead her sadly to develop an eating disorder. So these tests really need to be looked at with a bit more care. They cost a fair amount of money. Their utility is often questionable, and they lead people to be more worried, sometimes even neurotic about their health. So I don't mean to be redundant, but there's so much pressure from lab companies and so much marketing that the poor health consumer has really been led to think that functional, integrative, and natural medicine is all about treating labs. And this is not true. And I'm trying to really put a point on the evidence that underlies this. So this meta-analysis of 34 studies is a shining example of how listening to your symptoms was more accurate than treating or following a test result. Now, within this same realm of food allergy testing, I want to remind you of a study we've discussed in the past from 2022 in the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism. They looked at 28,000 individuals. They compared healthy to those who had IBS, and they found that healthy participants 52% of the time tested positive for IgG antibodies to various foods, leading these researchers to say or conclude that the food allergy testing, at least the IgG, does not seem to be different in healthy controls as compared to reactive individuals. This is different than IgE, meaning you have an anaphylactic or severe allergy. Different. But when trying to uncover sort of the insidious food allergy that may be causing your fatigue, your insomnia, your brain fog, your joint pain, your skin issues, the testing doesn't seem to be accurate. And as the study before this showcased, listening to your body is probably the best way to go. Now, within dysbiosis care, we'll oftentimes hear this recommendation of low FODMAP. So a moment ago, I said a dysbiosis test may find dysbiosis, it may find low diversity, and therefore your clinician may recommend high fiber, high prebiotic. Now, as a general statement, when one goes from a standard American diet that's lower prebiotic, lower vegetable, lower fruit, lower fiber, and moves toward a healthier diet, they're going to increase their levels of fiber and prebiotics, and that's going to be good for the individual. But if you're on somewhat of a healthy baseline diet, does it mean you have to go even higher fiber and higher prebiotic? No. And in some cases, it can make people worse, especially if they have active gastrointestinal symptoms. And that's what this study beautifully articulates. And this chart is showing you acute bloating after eating FODMAPs. This study also found that all of IBS symptoms tended to be flared by ingesting of a higher FODMAP content meal. But just to show you that there were controls, and you see IBS, constipative type, diarrheal type, and mixed type all had flaring of their symptoms. So it's important to bear this in mind when you have functional constipation and functional diarrhea that doesn't seem to be caused by, or there's just diarrhea, there's just constipation, there's not these other symptoms like pain, gas, bloating, right? So for this cohort that has sort of a mixture of digestive symptoms, FODMAPs can be problematic. Now, that also doesn't mean that you should avoid FODMAPs forever, but we use this ankle sprain analogy. If you sprain your ankle, could you run again? Yes. Could you run tomorrow? No. Would you need some time off running to rest and heal? Yes. And then after that, you should be able to get back to running. Same analogy, same parallel with low FODMAP and then reintroduction. In this next study, partially helps us understand why the low FODMAP diet is helpful, and then also opens up a door of inference as to why people seem to be able to reintroduce foods successfully after a period on lower FODMAP dieting. Now, caution, 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 this was an animal study, but it's the mechanism that I think is worthwhile sharing. So they found that mice fed a high FODMAP diet led to leaky gut, to increase LPS, lipopolysaccharide, a portion of the cell wall of bacteria that can trigger the immune system, and also increased mast cell activation, or said another way, increased activation of the immune system. I'm going to tie this in a moment with a nice schematic. But look at this. A low FODMAP diet reversed these changes. So we're going to be careful to avoid sort of the lane of heresy that we can often drift into. This does not mean low FODMAP forever for everyone. It does mean, similar to acute ankle sprain recovery, some time off of the ankle and then resuming normal activity or normal diet is the way to go. Now, part of what this schematic helps us understand is in a healthy gut lumen or lining, there's not leakage. And when there's not leakage across the membrane, you won't have a triggering of the immune system that resides on the other side. Remember that the largest density of immune cells in the entire body is in the small intestine, which is why I make such a key point of the importance of the small intestine. Now, in this physiology of leaky gut, you will have passage of things like LPS. So leaky gut leads to leakage of LPS through. And we've talked about some of these receptors before. TLR4 or toll-like receptor 4, which is the key receptor for LPS. Also toll-like receptor 2. And just as a tangent here, this dectin-1 we've discussed also in the past as a receptor for fungus. So, not related to this analogy, but just to try to tie together some of what you're seeing on this diagram. But when you have stimulation of these toll-like receptors, most namely 4, you will have the mast cell go through degranulation. And degranulation is a process through which the mast cell, which stores compounds like histamine, releases that histamine outward, and this triggers the immune response. So part of what happens when there's leaky gut is it calls the immune system in to respond. This is a good thing. This should happen. But when it happens in too high of a degree, you can have issues with inflammation, high histamine, and all of these result in symptoms like skin flushing, like brain fog, like irritability, like fatigue, perhaps even joint pain. So the key to a lot of these symptoms is to intervene upstream at the level of the gut leakage. And thankfully, this study found that mice fed high FODMAP triggered this, low FODMAP resolved this. And we've also discussed on the podcast in the past that one of the most evidence-based diets for IBS that doesn't respond to basic food quality improvements is the low FODMAP diet. Not forever, but as part of that maybe 1 or 2 month reparative phase followed by reintroduction. And we'll include in the description links to 3 different versions of the low FODMAP diet we've put together. The broadest, your standard low FODMAP. That's just out of the box low FODMAP diet. If you're trying to conform to an ancestral or paleo-like diet, we've combined some choice rules from paleo along with low FODMAP in the paleo low FODMAP diet, and also a vegetarian version of a low FODMAP diet. So those are available for you there as a free resource. So I've said a few times that we don't have to undergo the elimination or the low FODMAP forever, and it's important that we reintroduce. This next clinical trial helps us to really understand why it's important not to stay in the elimination phase forever. They looked at those with IBS plus or minus IBD, and all of the participants completed a symptom-guided or empiric, not lab testing guided, elimination diet for 2 weeks, followed by a reintroduction. Now, they documented a 89% improvement in quality of life, a 70% improvement in IBS symptoms, and a 68% of remission of IBS. But here's the key thing that I also want to point out for you. Now, this chart's a little bit busy, so I'm going to just make this simplified into sort of lay language. But their symptom severity decreased over time. It decreased sharply in that 2-week elimination phase. They maintained all of the improvements, and they even gained some more improvement with time as they went into the reintroduction and maintenance phase. This is so crucial because all too often people assume that if I cut out certain foods, I must stay off them forever, because if I ever reintroduce, I'm going to regress back to where I was before. And food fear is a serious thing. It is a common thing that we see in our practice and something we try to be very good about calling out on the podcast. So don't assume because a food is problematic at day 1, it will always be problematic. Usually with time and healing, tolerance improves. And that's the beautiful thing that they documented in this study, is that over time, with the reintroduction, people were able to maintain a high level of symptomatic improvement. Okay, so that's the last study that I wanted to share with you guys. I really hope this helps you navigate testing, diet, dysbiosis, and not get tripped up by some of the hurdles that are waiting for you out there. If this has been helpful, please share it. Please comment. These really help us to reach more people and help them stay on the right track for improving their health and most namely their gut health.